Hi, Rock. My name is Megan, and I'm one of the pastors here. I'm glad to be with you as we continue in our sermon series, 7 Things That Might Surprise You About God. I'm going to suggest today that these things about God might actually not be a surprise at all, that somewhere deep in ourselves, we know these things about God. We just have to return home to remember. To that end, would you mind keeping today's text, Psalm 82, open in your Bible or on your device? At the time of recording this sermon, I've actually just returned from an extended visit to Chicago, the place that I still call home. And it's not because we live there. No, we've been in the Boston area now for almost 5 years, and we really love and feel called to be here. But there is something that happens in my body when we start to get closer to Chicago. Whether it's flying in over Lake Michigan or driving west on I-90, something happens where I relax and I breathe more deeply. I feel so much peace. There's something about being in that physical city that my body remembers, and I can just rest and just be. Because home doesn't expect anything from you. It just loves you for existing. Your presence and yourself is a gift. At its best, I think that's what home should be. This time, however, that didn't happen as we entered the city limits. We went back to Chicago for memorial services for my mother-in-law and my grandma, 2 women who've impacted my life in pretty huge ways. It was my first time back since they've passed, and I was anxious about what everything would be like without their presence. When I crossed the threshold of my in-laws' home, on the surface, things looked and smelled and sounded relatively the same. The remembrance of restful time spent there flooded back, and I felt myself get less anxious. It's still the same. It's still okay. And a lot of it was. Our time as a family was good, but different because we were missing a key person who was so good at making a house a place of home. She would really listen to how you were, genuinely curious and caring for your soul. She would lay out towels and stock the toilet paper so you didn't have to find that stuff yourself. She had your favorite foods ready when you walked in the door and woke up with the kids so you could sleep as late as you wanted. My mother-in-law took care of all the small stuff. The small stuff that let you know that you were loved just for existing. You didn't have anything to prove here. The small stuff that said you were home. When it's missing, that small stuff adds up to be really big. As I reflected on why that felt so important to me, feeling at home or feeling cared for, God has been inviting me to consider why going home matters and how we as the church might need to consider what it means to be a people who find themselves at home with God. I'd love for you to take some time to share now with the folks on the chat or around you to these questions. Welcome back. Part of going home as a healthy adult is being able to hold in tension the multiple roles that we play in our families. So sure, I'm a parent and a spouse now, so I have to parent and care for my marriage when I go home. But my parents are still my parents, and so all of my living parents take joy in caring for me when we're together. I'm realizing that they are some of the only people that I can actually accept care from. For me, home is where I feel cared for and where it's okay for me to be tired, where I'm loved for who I am and not just what I can do. There's something that's predominant in the American psyche about what it means to grow up. We're meant to move out, seek independence, and be self-sufficient. Real men don't ask for directions, and real women can run companies, raise kids, and keep a clean house without any help. I mean, of course, I'm exaggerating, but somewhere along the way, we're taught that we need to be able to make it on our own. As parents, we strive to raise independent kids because as adults, we are valued for our own ability to be independent in society. Asking for help feels weak or embarrassing. Even if we don't need a lot of help, asking for any help might make us feel like it will result in the total loss of freedom or agency in our world. If you're older, you might resonate with that in conversations with your adult children around a change in your living situation. It's so hard when our self-worth and societal worth is tied up with our independence. I was talking to my friends recently about the shame that they felt in being eligible for free or reduced lunch growing up. They would have rather not eaten than be seen as needing financial help. That same principle is true now. Our orientation around independence means that our successes, our failures are because of our own choices, abilities, or internal fortitude. I know that that's been really hard for Brad and I in seasons where we've been tight financially. Asking for help makes me feel like we've failed. And honestly, we have failed sometimes. We've made mistakes and haven't been good stewards of the money that God has given us in the past. That's part of growing up, making mistakes and then making different choices as a result. But when that hasn't been the case in years and we just needed help, well, it's hard to ask for help when it comes with a perceived judgment about your character and worth. Perhaps as we grow up, something happens to us that makes us believe that we actually can't trust anyone else to have our backs. Maybe we've asked and been rejected. They'll judge us, hurt us, or leave us with more work than we started. Or realize that we've judged others who have kept these ideals. And so we've judged others who can't be independent and self-sufficient. We distance, disassociate, and gossip about them. So of course we don't want to be identified that way. Self-sufficiency isn't just something we strive for in order to be respected or valued, but it's what we have to work for in order to survive. I talked with my 95-year-old grandpa quite a bit this trip back about growing up in the Great Depression in Chicago. My grandpa was a second-generation Scottish immigrant whose mother had lost 2 husbands and found herself a single mother with 7 children in a new country, in a time where her brogue and background made her ineligible for a lot of the more genteel work in the United States. Looked pretty hopeless for their family until members of the local Covenant Church sort of took them all on. These Swedes were a little more established. They owned property and had a community that supported one another. So they passed my family around for a few months at a time. They would live in one 500-square-foot attic for a while and then move on to another with another family. My great-grandma worked 16-hour days at a local high school in the kitchen or cleaning and doing other odd jobs. She'd come home and cook by frying eggs on a brick that she heated up with an iron when they couldn't pay for the gas bill for the stove. These Swedes from the church would help give them some of their leftover cuts of meat or things that the bakeries that they owned were making. They would give my grandpa, who was now the de facto man of the house, jobs to help earn money. They would have not survived without the family of God welcoming them in and helping them. It was so significant for me to have been ordained recently in that same church that offered my family life almost 90 years later. Yet for every person that helped them, there were others that continually reminded my grandpa that they didn't belong. They were too poor, too ethnic, not educated enough. That experience in childhood made my grandpa grow up in ways that I recognize now were probably really traumatic. It was his goal in life to not just be independent, but to also be able to make sure that the whole family made it. That passed on expectations to my dad and his brother around taking care of the family business and not showing emotions because they too had to be independent and strong enough for my grandma and aunt. His value was based on his ability to provide the right kind of life and support. Friends, you might not be a child of the Great Depression, but every single one of us has experienced a time where we feel like we can't rely on anyone but ourselves, either because we don't trust someone else or because we have to prove ourselves worthy to them. And our culture is one that praises this posture. And at High Rock, I think overwhelmingly we are comprised of people who have made it in this world through being self-sufficient. But what if our need for self-sufficiency has come out of our own traumatic experiences? Because we are largely self-sufficient and successful in the world's eyes, we've just downplayed our own problems. I mean, it's just small stuff. Why would God care about that? The times that we've struggled to make ends meet or to be accepted, or perhaps when our needs have been rejected. What if our culture has actually conditioned us to feel like this way of life is normal? What if God is inviting us into something different through the small stuff, into healing? What if God is inviting us to come home? Would we have ears to hear? Would we accept that invitation? Today's text is one that is full of surprises, just like our God. The psalmist paints a picture, almost like a short film, of God holding court among all these lower gods. They could have imagined the gods of their neighbors, because the Israelites were a monotheistic people surrounded by folks who worshipped many gods. So let me read the beginning of this text to you again, and imagine that you're listening or watching as a listener at that time. From Psalm 82. God presides in the great assembly. He renders judgment among the gods. How long will you defend the unjust and show partiality to the wicked? Defend the weak and the fatherless. Uphold the cause of the poor and the oppressed. Rescue the weak and the needy. Deliver them from the hand of the wicked. There were gods that God would have been talking to who ensured a good harvest, fertility, victory in a war. These were all things that the people listening would have needed in order to feel secure and to prosper. But the reality is that while many would have lived a life trying to appease these gods in order to be secure, most people's lives were hard. And so these false gods could only ever produce security for a portion of the population. But the focus of this text, the weak, the orphans, widows, the oppressed, and the needy, are ignored by these false gods. In fact, in their stories, some of them delighted in people becoming poor and hurt. Instead, God lays into those false gods for having favored the unjust and the wicked. Depending on how we read this text, we might feel self-loathing or maybe self-righteousness. There are 4 characters that we can identify in this text. I wonder who you might identify with. One of the uncomfortable things in this exercise for me is that I can really identify with all 4 of the characters outlined, and that just feels more confusing. The weak and the oppressed? I mean, I know that as a white, able-bodied and minded cisgender woman who's married and not just employed but in a position of power, I'm not really oppressed in the United States, not in the same way that many others are. And on a global scale, gosh, I have it made. But I do feel weak and needy. I am really tired emotionally and mentally. I don't feel like I have much space anywhere, not in our house and not in my head. Does that count as enough? Okay, well, if I'm not weak and needy, maybe I'm just the weak and the unjust, or the wicked and the unjust. I mean, I try not to be wicked or unjust, and I know that, I am. I'm not perfect, but really that bad? But that feels like the only alternative on the human front. Okay, so maybe not human. Maybe I'm more like a false god, but does that mean that I really favor the wicked and unjust? I mean, gosh, I really try not to, but I'm sure that I do, and it's just not on purpose. I'm not even really sure that I know wicked and unjust people, but to be God, that's what's left. That feels really audacious, possibly blasphemous, and untenable. I invite you to name that now, your answer to that question. In this text that we see the 4 characters outlined, who do you resonate with, if you're honest? The weak and oppressed? The unjust and wicked? The gods who show favor to the unjust? Or perhaps God, who brings righteous anger against those false gods? Take some time now in the chat or with those around you and name who you identify with in this text and why, if you're able. Welcome back, and thanks for taking time to share honestly. Maybe your reflection sounded like mine, where it's really hard to choose from any of those categories. I wonder if that's because we have shame around the ways that we've ignored the suffering of those around us. And so it makes us feel like we don't deserve the sort of protection and help that God is offering. Let's get a little deeper into the text and see how the psalmist's words might continue to invite us to further clarity today. When I'm looking for clarity in a biblical text, I always come back to the question, what might the author of this text trying to tell the reader about the character of God? In contrast to the gods, we see that God's way is to defend the weak and the fatherless, uphold the cause of the poor and the oppressed, to rescue the weak and the needy and deliver them from the hands of the wicked. While the gods saw some people as disposable, God saw their care and flourishing as necessary. When we find ourselves in the position of feeling weak or in need, this part of God's character is immensely comforting. If God is for us, who can be against us? But for many of us watching today, we don't know that we deserve this sort of protection or advocacy from God. I mean, there are so many people that are in more need than me. I'm not oppressed, not really. In fact, I should probably work harder so that I don't become one of the oppressed and take more of God's energy or my pastor's time or the church or the government's money. I mean, I'm strong enough, I'm able enough, I'm financially stable enough, educated enough, I'm fill in the blank enough, but I'm not that needy. Friends, there is so much brokenness in this world. I don't want to downplay that. There is immense poverty, the environment is suffering, and the impact of colonization and slavery continue to plague us. Injustice can feel so big. But God is calling us to come home, trusting that God will take care of the big stuff, but also to lay down our small things. And in the laying down of the small stuff, perhaps we can start to live in God's kingdom, where we can together find freedom from the big stuff too. Because unlike the gods that can only bless some at the expense of others, our God's way offers care, love, and blessing for everyone, for all of the earth and everything in it belongs to God. One of the lies that the false god of self-sufficiency tells us is that we need to take care of the small stuff by ourselves. And lies have this funny tendency of snowballing into bigger ones until we start to value ourselves not for who we are as God's beloved children, but for what we can do. Pastor Oshita Moore, in her book, Dear White Peacemakers, describes it beautifully. It is a violation of our God-given identities as human beings, not human doings. We were made to reflect the generous, self-giving love of God. God never expected us to prove our worth or fight for significance. We were already worthy. We were already significant. Returning home to God, recognizing that God was always looking to care for the big stuff and the small stuff, was the call to the reader of this psalm from Israel. And it's the call to us today. The images that are conjured up through this prayer are offered as an anchor to the listener. Don't choose the gods that have these empty half promises. They might work out for you now, but they'll pass away, just like the short, fleeting fulfillment that they offer. Self-sufficiency might get you that house, and that second one. It might get you the newest car or phone or the prestigious degree or job title. You will work hard, and people will notice it, and they will praise you. And you won't be disappointed by other people who let you down along the way, because let's face it, group projects take way too long, and we can do it better and faster on our own. What about the cost of it all? What about your sleepless nights or your jammed calendar? The overwhelming feeling of responsibility. If you don't get it done, who will? What about your kids or the other people in your life? Do you know them? Do they know you? I know that when I'm operating this way, it's really hard for me to just be with people and connect with them. And I end up feeling even more alone than I did before. It makes me wonder, do my kids and my friends also feel that same overwhelming responsibility? And they can't ask for help for fear of being seen as weak? Those gods know nothing. They walk around in darkness, and following their way shakes the foundations of the earth. It creates chaos, instability, and death. Church, I don't want that future for you, for me, for the next generation. I want a different way. But the psalmist calls us to look at God, who is bigger and has a more expansive future for everyone. A God who can ask without words, don't you want to be with me, to be with that God? A few hundred years after this psalm was written, the people of God had been living in exile, slaves in an empire that valued them for their human doingness instead of as human beings. They were going to be released and go home. The book of Deuteronomy was written so that these folks could remember this God of expansive promise and hope and return to God. Deuteronomy 32 stands as this other reference in this text, comparing God to these other gods. It reminds the people that God had claimed them as children before when they were in need. In a desert land, he found them. In a barren and howling waste, he shielded them and cared for them. He guarded them as the apple of his eye, like an eagle that stirs up its nest and hovers over its young, that spreads its wings to catch them and carries them aloft. The Lord alone led them. No foreign god was with them. God had taken them out of oppression and met their needs. Look at that language there. God shielded them and cared for them because they were loved. So these people who once again could not turn away from their immense need were returning home. But before they could, they needed to return to God and the truth of their beloved identity. In the beginning of the sermon, I talked about how at its best, returning home is returning to a place where we're loved, just for being ourselves. There aren't conditions or expectations. You don't have to work for it. You can just show up and be a part of the family. It's where you're reminded that you don't have to be self-sufficient. In fact, it's where the lie that any of us can actually thrive and be self-sufficient can be named and rebuked. In the safety and care of home, confession, repentance, and a new way forward can be explored. Following the false god of self-sufficiency is the undercurrent of American society. And on the surface, it's easy to see how it penalizes and hurts those who cannot be self-sufficient for whatever reason. This is the systemic manifestation of this sin. Laws, education, housing, and pay work against those whose bodies, minds, or collective histories don't allow them to be self-sufficient. So there's a constant struggle between being seen as a full, valuable human through gaining independence and the reality that you cannot, because there is way too much big stuff in the way. Racism, ableism, misogyny. This is all really big stuff. But that undercurrent of self-sufficiency doesn't just hurt the weak and the oppressed in those big systemic ways. It hurts those in power, those who are perceived as strong and privileged too. Just because we can make it as a mostly self-sufficient people doesn't mean that it's the best way for us. Our continued worship of the God of self-sufficiency takes us farther and farther away from home, from a place of being known and loved. We value ourselves for our doingness. And suppose that our hurts, fears, and weakness somehow make us less valuable. We continue to move farther from home as we make choices that build on this lie. When we work to get ahead, not asking for help and shouldering the load solo. We make sure to say the right thing in person and online, ensuring that we're not looking inexperienced or uneducated. But returning home is, as Native author Caitlin Curtis puts it, holy work and a sacred journey. It's shedding the labels and expectations that these false gods tell us to work towards and the things that the world tells us would make us valuable and remembering who we are at our core. This is the center of the Christian life, this journey home in union with the Christ who goes before us. When God put on flesh in Jesus, this different way was lived out. Christ rejected self-sufficiency and chose a life that embodied reliance on God and God's community. It wasn't for Jesus' own benefit, but it was out of a desire to be in love and solidarity with God's beloved, with you and me, and with the entirety of creation. He trusted that God could hold the small stuff. And it grew into trusting God with the big stuff. And this culminated in the work on the cross, where Christ was emptied out in death. In that death and subsequent resurrection, this way that seems like madness, this radical trust and life of service, there was a new way out of that for all of us. It was embodied fully in Jesus. These other gods have fallen, like every ruler before them who could only deliver a half-life. But our God, this God, calls all of creation to full life. So I wonder, could we trust that God might be calling us home? To be like my mother-in-law, who will just welcome you in and love you just for being you? That you don't need to have it all together or prove yourself? And God is inviting you to turn away from these false gods and to trust that God cares about all of you, all of that small stuff that you don't think is worth mentioning. Church, I think that if we can practice stepping out in trust with God's people, confessing our weaknesses and making our needs known, the freedom from this God of self-sufficiency will start to come for the oppressed and the oppressor alike. The needs that you might need met can be something that someone else can fill, and you may be able to meet theirs also. Empathy, relationships, and unity grow when you're home because we give and receive from a place of security. So this week, try naming the places you feel weak or unable to do it all. See if someone can meet that need or give you permission to lay down that burden. And pay attention to those in your life who you need to meet without judgment or shame when they express need. It might feel like small stuff in the grand scheme of things, but it all adds up to a big new reality. By asking for or accepting help with small things like setting the table, doing homework, watering the plants while you're away, we start to experience a little bit of God's care for those small things. And honestly, sometimes asking for or receiving help in those things might not feel small at first. We're not conditioned to feel like we can even acknowledge that we need that help. But over time, that gets easier, and we'll want to extend that same care for others. So we'll be better prepared for the act of trusting God in those really big things. Friends, in all of this, remember that nothing is too big or too small for our God, who calls you beloved and calls you home.